Now call on Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan. Yeah, you're sharing with Deputy Mayor. Is that agreed? It's agreed. Okay, 10 minutes each. Okay.
10, you said?
10 minutes, yeah.
Gormaga, Theresa Gringo Jackal Pigs, 5 and egg Tamani, taxi. August Kudjan Fragris and Villasha, Ocnadoilam Gwil Fragri Galer. I think I've lost count of the number of taxi men and women recently whom I've met who tell me of the difficulties of making a living from driving a taxi. And then there's other regulations that have been put in place, and some of them seem to be just put in the way to make life particularly difficult for them. I don't think anybody objects to regulation, provided that it's fair and equitable, and that it does have the best interests of those it's trying to regulate at heart. So just looking at some of those regulations. I know the objectives are to do with quality of the taxi industry and ensuring the safety of taxi passengers. I'm kind of thinking back to 2003 Act. You know, my impressions were we did have a quality service and passengers were safe generally. And even going back to the 70s, when I probably used a taxi for the first time, I think I was aware that we were getting a good service. But that doesn't mean that there weren't areas in need of reform and regulation. The one item of major concern to taxi drivers, of course, is the issue of oversupply. And that's the one item that the bill is not addressing or trying to regulate. Now, being from Dublin and from Dublin Central, I see the queues of taxis all the time, waiting for the fares, and there's very, very visible evidence of oversupply. And it was just yesterday I had to take a taxi, and the man told me that I was the second fare in 6 hours. So we know that the large increase in numbers came around 2000, and the Taxi Review Group in 2011 said the oversupply was about 13 to 22%, but I think that's a bit of an underestimate. And it's very surprising that the Taxi Review Group didn't recommend capping numbers. No doubt when the downturn came, it was easy to get a taxi plate. And those who were taxi drivers, whose sole means of income it was driving a taxi, they were facing strict, very severe competition from the double jobbers and from the increase in those people who found it so easy to get a taxi, and that seemed to be the answer to the lack of jobs. And I think if that had been handled more efficiently, then I think we would have had a better industry. And I think it was that lack of regulation that really opened the floodgates. We know that it's all about, as with most jobs, it's all about exit and entrance. And I think in the taxi area that the numbers are not matching. There's far more entering than there are exiting. So it's making it very difficult for taxi drivers to earn an adequate income, which results in them working much longer hours and sometimes working beyond what they should be working. And of course there's issues there in relation to health and safety. Because if they work well over the permitted time, that could be a serious risk to themselves, to the passengers and to other road users. So I think tackling the numbers has to be the first step. And I want to bring one particular example where we look at lines of taxis waiting on a fare. And this could take a few hours. But there are parts in the inner city where these lines are not near public toilets and where it's not possible for the taxi drivers to get to a public toilet, with the unfortunate consequence of nearby lanes and corners being used as urinals. And this has caused a lot of annoyance to communities in the inner city who've had to walk past. And it has meant that the local authorities have had to come out and do a lot of power washing in these particular areas. On another matter, drivers, in cold weather, you can't blame them from leaving the engines running for heat. But again, this is not very economically or environmentally friendly. Coming along Dame Street last Friday night, it was kind of like taking your life in your hands, the amount of taxis that were double parked and just idling trying to pick up fares. Now, I know the arguments against the regulating of numbers about competition and ensuring an adequate supply, ensuring new entrants and customers having a good supply, and that if the competition is not intense, standards will fall. But I don't necessarily agree with all of that. The Indican report notes that attempts to restrict numbers led to difficulties as regulators were not very good in estimating the level of supply needed to meet demand, but that's no reason not to try and regulate the numbers so that we do have reasonable competition, an adequate supply of taxis, and we can ensure that taxi drivers can earn a reasonable income and work reasonable hours. And we look at other jobs and professions with incentives to retire. But I know taxi drivers are self-employed, but maybe there is a need for some incentives to encourage retirement in certain areas, that there will be some matching between the entrance and exit. I don't think the industry can take any more new entrants at this point in time, and certainly not in Dublin. But I do support what other TDs are saying about rural areas, because certain rural areas could do with a more comprehensive taxi service, because we know the sadness and loneliness in isolated parts of rural Ireland and the social consequences. So I do believe there is a role for the taxi industry. One implication of the new mandatory disqualifications for the conviction of certain offences means that some current drivers may lose their licences. Fair enough if that is warranted, but I do hope that there is a very fair system and that there will be an appeal system and that this is not going to be used as a way to restrict numbers. In the past, the number of taxis were inadequate to the demand, and finding one at certain hours, certain nights, certain occasions was like finding gold dust in the city. And getting a plate almost required to have gold dust as well, because such was the costs in those times. And I know we don't want to go back to that. But we don't want to see what's happening now, which is the oversupply, the long and the unhealthy hours, and too many looking for too few resources. Now, there is an issue with the wheelchair accessible taxis, which are very badly needed, and I do think those taxi drivers do a fantastic job. But the number of specially adapted wheelchair accessible taxis is falling. They're very expensive to buy, they're very expensive to adapt, they're very expensive to maintain. And everybody is on for taxis being properly maintained and kept in good condition. But I think it's causing, at this economic downturn, very severe difficulties for taxi men to try to replace those, and I think that has to be looked at. There's an issue that has come up just recently, again back to Dublin. Taxi drivers who normally have the rank at the Gresham Hotel are now going to be moved because of the Lewis Works. So they have to be moved from a really prime location where quite a number of them are accommodated on O'Connell Street, and there's only going to be a few spaces, and again it's going to be in a street that's off O'Connell Street. So it's going to again put additional stress on these particular men and women who are looking for fares. One of the things struck me when I was reading, and it was kind of like too many chiefs. We look at the NTA, taxi regulator, Garda Síochána. And just looking at one example, the Garda Síochána issued the SP/SV driver licences. The NTA administers the test. And then it's back to the Garda to certify the person is fit and proper. And then the NTA issues the SP/SV, the vehicle licences. And it just seems to me, again, this idea of a lack of coordination between all of these, that one authority might do the whole lot. So before I finish, just a couple of acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge the increasing difficulties for taxi drivers, and it has resulted in an increased number of suicides among taxi drivers. I want to acknowledge that they do fantastic charity work, and we see it in Dublin on certain occasions, and the charitable organisations that they get involved with. On the downside, they do take chances, and we've all seen examples of the U-turns in the middle of the street and of the stopping in the middle of the road to let fares off. And we do know that there's a kind of a love-hate relationship between taxi drivers and cyclists, but I do think if they could operate on mutual respect and if each of them kept all the rules of the road. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Deputy, as you're the Deputy in possession